Thought Leaders, a closer look for the curious.
Welcome to Ask a Writer, 30 Minutes with Una Mannion. I'm Una, and thank you very much to everyone who's watching today and who sent in questions about writing and the writing process. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Una Mannion. I'm Program Chair of the Writing and Literature BA at IT Sligo. I've been writing for about 7 or 8 years. I started in Sligo with a writing group. There was about 10 of us at the start, and maybe about 7 diehards that stuck together. And initially we were writing stories that we shared with the group, and eventually we started to submit those stories to journals and competitions. And a group of us, in fact, all of us started to get we were getting shortlisted. We sometimes got published in journals. And so that was really exciting. And we also started to step into, I suppose, going to writing festivals and really stepping into the fray and trying to be part of a writing community. In about 2018, I started working on a novel, which was published last year with Faber in the UK and with HarperCollins in the US. It's called A Crooked Tree. It was my debut novel. And so what I'm hoping to do, a lot of the questions today are about how to get published, that process. So I can share with you my experience and what I've learned from my friends who write and who are getting published. So I'm going to go ahead and I have a pile of questions here that have come in. And the first question is, how do you feel when you write? And the answer to that could be dreadful. I feel dreadful. But I think I'd like to answer that question. Writing isn't easy, but I think what I would say is that I know how I feel when I don't write. And when I don't write, I feel that I'm missing something, or a part of me is missing. I feel that I've left, it's like leaving something in a restaurant and you're miles down the road. Something is missing for me. It makes me anxious. And so the only way to work through that and to feel good about myself and to feel productive is to keep writing and that discipline. So I think, that question was really interesting to me because I really thought it's how I feel when I don't write. And when I sit down to write, sometimes it's the blank page and staring into nothing and nothing's happening, and that's frustrating. And then there's these golden moments where the keyboard and the screen disappear and you're in it and there's just flow and it's happening and you've forgotten, everything else has disappeared. And those moments don't happen that often. And to get them, you have to have that discipline of, I think, arriving at the desk every day and sitting through those times that don't feel so good and are frustrating, and you might not want to be there. But those moments will happen. Sylvia Plath has a beautiful moment in a poem called Black Rook in Rainy Weather, exactly about that moment, and she refers to it as an angel at her elbow. That where something happens and you're in a trance and things flow for you. So the next question, what part of writing is the most difficult part? And I thought about this in that in some ways the writing has 2 parts. I think there's the first draft part where you're writing, where you have an idea, but it doesn't know what it quite is yet. So you're writing onto a blank page. You're not sure what's going to come next. It's uncertain. It's scary. You feel like you're writing into an abyss. It's lonely, but you have to keep, you write forward. And I think that part for me personally, is the more difficult part, is getting the story down, getting the first bits on the page. And the first drafts are always terrible. And I've had to reassure myself about that, that if I try to make it too perfect, I'll never write forward, and I'll never get that white, writing in white heat, that energy of just writing forward. And sometimes great writing happens when you don't overthink it too much. The second part of the writing, which is, I suppose, is the revision and editing part, I really enjoy that part. You're going in like a sculptor, and you're excising out, and you're moving things around, and you're shaping it. There's a lot of cutting. There's a lot of streamlining and cutting out all the extraneous elements. And I guess like in sculpture, and I know it's an overused metaphor, but something starts to come a shape, and you start to see what the piece is. And sometimes it's not what you thought it was when you were in that first phase and you were uncertain, and I think for me personally, I find that first part is hard and difficult, the blank page and just getting started. Some people are plotters, they plot, and so maybe they don't have that feeling of uncertainty. I'm not a great plotter. I tend to write to discover what's going to happen. And I guess there's something about that whole element of uncertainty, which is also about possibility. Anything could happen. Stephen King loves to talk about that what if. He's not a plotter. He says he's never plotted even half a page of a story, but he asks the question, what if, and just goes like, what if this crazy thing happened? Or what if, someone did something? So the next question is, I started a PhD this year and wondered what tips or advice you have how to balance work and home life. I have 2 young children. Yeah, I think this is a really good question about whether you're doing academic writing or creative writing, how you safeguard writing time, and how you balance that with all the other demands of work and children. I did a PhD a number of years ago before I started creative writing, and I didn't finish the PhD until I had children. And I can't explain that except to say that when my time got diminished and I had these other commitments, I started to use time very differently. And I started to safeguard the time that I had. So my advice or tips would be to have designated times where you really do get space to write and to ring fence that. The other tip I would have is that I think I researched for like 5 years too long, and never stepping. So whether you're doing academic writing or creative writing, there are times where you just need to start writing and stop the research and stop all, and allow there to be something to work with. So I recommend, start writing. The other thing is that I still hold this to be true, that I personally need long, immersive stretches of time when I'm working. I really love that, being in the story, and it's all I think about, and it's all I'm asked to think about. But the reality is that none of our lives are like that. And I got much better at using small spurts of time. So like getting up at 5 in the morning and writing from 5 to 8. Sitting in the car with my laptop and arriving for the school pickups like an hour early. I just have the laptop and there's nothing else to distract me. So getting really economical with how I use time. And I mean, it took me a really long time to write my PhD, so I'm the last person that should be ever giving anybody advice on how to work-life balance and write a PhD. But I do think that it can be done, and it's also to prioritize your work. And I know from teaching that when I had students that would be in front of me that day, I always prioritized the lecture because they would be in front of me. And even though the lecture was written, I would still be, fine-tuning it and tweaking it. When I had this other project that really needed my attention, and it's easy to put off your stuff. It's easy to prioritize everybody else's learning, their well-being. And I think you have to value the work that you're doing and set boundaries around that. And for me, that took me a very long time to do. I feel like I've only started to do that around the writing in recent years. So, thank you for that question, and good luck with the PhD. So, there's a few questions. I'm going to read the next few questions. All relate to publishing. The first one is, what do you need to have ready to approach a publisher? How difficult is it to publish books today? And what is the likelihood of work being published without an agent or support from someone established in industry? Is it a waste of time? So I'm going to sort of treat those questions collectively. And I'm speaking from my own experience and maybe from what I know from talking to other writers and talking to agents and publishers. I taught a module last year called Publishing and Professional Practice. And each week we had visiting professionals from they were agents, they were editors, they worked in publishing houses. And it was really useful to hear what they had to say to our students also about getting published. Most agents and publishing houses seem to be interested in full manuscripts. So it used to be someone might send like the first 10,000 words of a manuscript, and that can still happen because the idea is so brilliant or it had such a hook. But generally, and my own experience was that the agent was looking for a full finished manuscript to submit. You can approach a publishing house directly, but most people would try to get an agent first. And having an agent who has looked at your work, who then approaches the publishing houses, is really useful. And my advice would be that if you're sending work to an agent, you really want the work to be as good as it can be. And I do think that the kind of support you might look for at that time is like having a writing group or having a friend who's, editing skills you trust or someone you trust as a reader. But sometimes you have one shot with an agent, and I think you should really, really make the most of that one shot and not send something that may not be ready. To find an agent and to send work to an agent, I would really recommend that you look at authors you like, where you think there's a good fit. So you don't just randomly send it to any agent, but you send it to a specific agent and you tell them why there's a fit between what you've written and the kind of books that they've published. And in your statement of interest letter, when you're writing this introductory or query letter to an agent, you're explaining exactly what that fit is. And I guess there are, if you're interested in finding, like there's a book called The Writers and Artists Yearbook. It comes out every year. It's published by Bloomsbury. So for the 2022, the book probably came out in last summer. And there are sections on literary agents, prizes, competitions, festivals, how to self-publish, because that's another option that increasingly some books have done really well from the self-publishing process. So you can find agents that way. There's a website, Jericho Writers. It's I think it's a UK-based group. They have a list of all the UK agents and the kinds of books they publish. So you could look them up. There's also Poetry Ireland is a great resource in Ireland. And if you go there and look at literary agents in Ireland, you'll see all the agents who operate in Ireland. And there's I think probably about 20 times more in the UK than there are in Ireland. And a lot of Irish writers, including myself, have agents in the UK. I do think it helps to have started to try to step into the fray, as I mentioned earlier, like going to festivals, trying to get stories published, doing the competitions. I entered a poem in the New Irish Writing, the Hennessy Award in the Irish Times. It's now run by the Independent, but at the time it was the Irish Times, and that poem was selected and published, and then it won that year. It won the overall New Poetry Award, and that gave me a foot up. And I didn't know anyone. It was the very first thing I ever published. So, it's not a closed club, which is kind of great that they read everything that comes in, and everybody, it's a level playing field. But having started that process and entering story competitions, I suppose people became aware of what I was doing. And I was very lucky in that an Irish writer called Sinead Gleeson, who she edited The Art of the Glimpse, 100 Irish Short Stories. She had judged a number of competitions that I had won. And she sent copies of my stories to her agent, Peter Strauss at RCW in London. And he contacted me and he said, I'm interested, I like the voice, in the stories, but I'm interested in a novel and I heard you're working on one. And would you let me have a read when you're finished? So I think that was like in October, and I kind of started working all day, every day, because I had this goal, and that was great to have that. And he read the manuscript in January and signed me, and then sold the book to Faber. So I had an agent, and that made things quite easy for me. But there are publishing houses that accept direct submissions, and they open their submission windows at certain times of the year. In Ireland, Tramp Press, who've published, Sarah Baum, Mike McCormick, Doireann Griffna, there are so many great writers on there that they've published. They read every manuscript. So you can send Tramp Press a manuscript directly. And the two women who run that press are brilliant, and they've done so much for Irish writing. Lilliput Press also accepts direct submissions. But sometimes you'll contact, the questions were about approaching a publisher, and a lot of publishers will say, we don't accept submissions for fiction. You must come through a literary agent. Not all, but a lot of them do. And that actually, a number of the questions, the next cluster of questions actually were about publishing children's books. So one person is asked, I want to write a children's book for ages 3 to 8. Is it difficult to get this age group published since there are so many books for that age group? And the second question is, hi, I'd love to create children's books. How do I get published? I've written my book, and I can only seem to find one Irish publisher who publishes 5 or 6 books a year. So earlier I mentioned the Bloomsbury, the Writers and Artists Yearbook, and it's like a Bible. There's one for children's publishing, and it's the Children's Writers and Artists Yearbook. And in that, you'll see straight away all the agents that deal specifically with children's literature. And again, as I was talking about earlier with a manuscript, there's a lot of things that I suppose you want to have the manuscript as ready as it can be. With children's publishing, there are children's publishers who take submissions directly. So Bloomsbury, Harcourt Mifflin, they have submission windows where you can send a children's book. I guess because like a book for the age group of 3 to 8 has a much shorter word count, so they probably can read more books. But again, have the book ready. Make sure that you've worked on developing character, and that it has voice, and that it doesn't fall into cliche and all those sort of rules around writing. And when you're looking for an agent, find an agent that deals specifically with children's books. So, for instance, in advance of this, I looked at my own agency's website, and they have a children's literature section, and then it says, please do not send children's literature to any agent. Please send it to the relevant agent. And then you can search in their agents, and there's a filter for children. And then it came up, there are 3 agents in that agency that deal specifically with children's literature, everything from age 3 to 8 up to YA or young adult fiction. So my advice would be I would initially look for an agent. But people self-publish, and books do really, books increasingly do really well, self-published books. And there's all these platforms in which to promote and sell your book. And again, the Children's Writers and Artists Yearbook has a section on self-publishing and advice, and you have the experience of all these people who've done it before, and some of whom are working as full-time children's authors. So I hope that answers the publishing questions. The next question is, where is your favorite place in Sligo to get inspiration to write? And I think we're so lucky, living in Sligo. I spend a lot of time outdoors. I walk every morning in the woods, and I spend a lot of time around Cullinamore and Strandhill. And really, everywhere you go, it's quite brisk, the Atlantic winds. And, I always feel revived after I've been outside and ready to write. I never write outside, and I probably don't write about specific locations, but I think there's something about the landscape here and the history of people on this landscape, and the way where you walk has a place name, and this kind of these stories connected to place has been very influential in me even starting to write. And the first things I wrote about, for example, the poem that I submitted to the Irish Times for the New Irish Writing, that won the Hennessy Award, was based on an excavation that took place in Cullinamore in my family's field in 1981, where they excavated a child's body was found in the oyster midden, and it was a complete surprise. They weren't looking for that, and it was a child's body in what they call a crouched burial, a fetal position, with a blue glass bead and a brass by the rib, and a brass earring, and so that. My first published piece came literally out of the landscape in Sligo. And I think that the storytelling and that kind of tradition of looking at landscape and history has completely inspired me. I want to say that if you saw where I wrote at home, I have a desk that looks out at the coal bunkers. It's very uninspiring, and I need to work on that. It's actually in a hallway. So I recommend, if you can, getting a room of your own to write. This next question, are writers born or made? And I want to really emphatically say that in my opinion, writers are made. That idea that writers are somehow this special brand of people where birth equals worth, and they, descend from, some kind of magic place is I think is really alienating for people who want to write. It makes it feel like it's a special club, an exclusive club, that you have to be special to get into. I think there's probably potential class overtones around that as well, about, if you didn't grow up with books, or, you didn't finish school, that somehow you're not a writer. And so I think it's a romantic myth, and that it's been exclusive. And I think that writers are made. They're made by their experiences, about the things that they've been through, what they've witnessed, what they notice. And I would really strongly, advocate that position. And I feel quite strongly about that. And as a teacher who teaches on a writing program, I also feel protective of that concept. So, there's one last question. What are your top 3 novels you feel everyone should try to read at least once? That's a really difficult question because there's so many. And I think when I first looked at that question, I was thinking automatically my go-to books tend to be American because I grew up in America. And I find myself going back to books that were really formative for me. So the novelist Toni Morrison, any novel by her, like I suppose like Beloved and Song of Solomon are the first books of hers that I read there's magic realism and this whole history in these books and the beauty of the language. I loved them. I was talking today to my editor who's based in London at Faber, and she was telling me that I was asking her just about how she became an editor, actually. And she was telling me that she had done an internship after college with this publishing house in San Francisco run by a writer called Dave Eggers. And I immediately was like, there's a book called A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius. I think it came out in the early 90s. I'm not even sure, by Dave Eggers. And it was, I think, one of the most important books I read. It's absolutely beautiful. And for some reason, it inspired me to want to write. I always remember afterwards, like keeping a journal, and maybe he felt like someone not that different to me growing up in a suburb. And Dave Eggers has gone on to he does all these programs to promote writing amongst young people. He's an amazing person. I was thinking about Irish writers then and Irish novels. And recently, I suppose the Irish novel that I really think everyone should have a go at is Anna Burns's Milkman. I loved this book. I loved the sort of stream of conscious intensity of it. It takes a few pages to get into because sometimes you realize a sentence is just going on for a full page and longer. But she evokes this world and this whole system, and obviously referencing Northern Ireland and growing up in Belfast, but without ever naming anything. She just conjures this world. And I think it's brilliant. But I guess ultimately, those are 3 stand-up books for me. But I think reading, there's just endless novels that you could read. And I think part of the preparation of trying to write is to really read and read voraciously and read widely and weirdly, and to step into it. So thank you so much for all the questions and for having me today.
Thought Leaders, a closer look for the curious.